Barb's abduction. Barb was Nancy Wheeler's best friend who went with her to Steve Harrington's party. While sitting alone by the pool, she cut her hand on a beer can and looked super depressed. Honestly, it made me depressed just watching. Unfortunately, Netflix had it out for Barb when a Demogorgon was attracted to her blood and dragged her through a portal into the Upside Down. Poor Barb. She found herself trapped in the dark mirror version of Hawkins, completely alone and terrified. She likely endured prolonged isolation in the suffocating, poisonous air while experiencing agonizing internal dissolution from the gross slug creatures. Her remains were later discovered partially liquefied with one of the slug creatures emerging from her mouth. Yucky. Barb's fate was worse than death because she experienced days of paralyzing terror, suffocation, and torture while conscious and without hope of rescue. But Season 2 brought collective suffering to entire groups of people. Hive assimilation. Ordinary Hawkins residents, including farmers, shopkeepers, and families, were unwittingly drawn into the Shadow Monster's expansion as its underground tunnel network spread beneath their homes and businesses. The entity's influence crept through contaminated crops, infected animals, and expanding vine networks that targeted anyone who came into contact with the growing biomass. These innocent civilians had no knowledge of the supernatural threat consuming their community. The townsfolk were controlled through spore inhalation during routine activities like farming or walking outdoors, or through direct vine entanglement when they investigated strange occurrences on their property. Once infected, their bodies were systematically drained of life force while their minds became trapped in collective visions shared with the Hive consciousness. Their individual personalities and memories were slowly erased as they became fuel for the entity's growth. Their physical remains were integrated into the expanding biomass of the underground tunnels, with their life essence absorbed to strengthen the Shadow Monster's presence in Hawkins. Their fate was worse than death through the gradual erosion of individual identity within a shared hive mind, enduring physical decay while being forced to contribute to the monstrous entity's expansion. The townsfolk's assimilation built the Shadow Monster's power base, but individual cases like Heather showed how the entity targeted personal relationships. Heather's kidnapping. Heather Holloway was a cheerful lifeguard at Hawkins Community Pool during the summer of 1985, working alongside Billy Hargrove. Her friendly personality and stable family life made her an ideal target for the Mind Flayer's manipulation tactics, as her genuine happiness provided a perfect cover for infiltration. Billy, already under the Mind Flayer's control, specifically chose Heather because of her trustworthy nature and close family relationships. After Billy kidnapped Heather from the pool, she was infected at the good old Brimborn Steelworks building, where black veins began spreading across her skin. As she lost her free will to the hive mind, she was even manipulated into luring her own parents into the trap, using their love and trust against them while mentally screaming, but unable to control her actions. She fucked up her dad as well, I'm not gonna lie. Whole-ass wine bottle to the head. Ouch. Heather remained mentally trapped and aware, but powerless as she participated in flaying other innocent victims. Her personality twisted into cold obedience while her real self watched in horror. She eventually melted alive into grotesque biomass at Brimborn Steelworks. Her liquefied remains absorbed to enlarge the spider monster that terrorized them all. Heather's personal betrayal of her family showed how the Mind Flayer weaponized love and trust, but Season 4's victims faced even more personalized psychological torture. Chrissy's death. Chrissy Cunningham was a popular cheerleader at Hawkins High who seemed to have everything going for her, but she was secretly struggling with an eating disorder and emotional abuse from her controlling mother. Vecna targeted her specifically because of these deep psychological wounds, using her trauma as the perfect entry point for his curse. Her torment began weeks before her death with severe headaches, hallucinations, and nightmares that forced her to relive her mother's constant body shaming and criticism about her weight and appearance. The curse escalated into waking hallucinations where Chrissy saw her mother's rotting corpse, delivering the same abusive messages she'd heard throughout her childhood. She experienced visions of black widow spiders crawling over her body and heard the ominous chiming of a grandfather clock that symbolized her approaching doom. The psychological buildup lasted for days, with each hallucination becoming more vivid and terrifying as Vecna invaded deeper into her traumatized mind. On March 21st, 1986, Chrissy finally succumbed to Vecna's final attack while buying drugs from Eddie Munson to help her sleep through the nightmares. She levitated in his trailer while her bones snapped audibly, her limbs twisted at impossible angles, and her eyes were gouged out before she died, opening the first gate to the Upside Down. Chrissy's weeks of psychological torment made her actual death almost a mercy compared to the mental anguish she endured. Fred's death. Fred Benson was a dedicated student journalist at Hawkins High who carried devastating guilt from a car accident he'd caused the previous year that resulted in another person's death. His perfectionist personality and need to document everything made him constantly replay the tragedy in his mind, creating the exact psychological vulnerability that Vecna needed to establish his curse. The guilt consumed Fred daily as he tried to maintain his academic performance while secretly believing he deserved punishment for his role in someone's Fred's death. Fred's curse began with the familiar symptoms of severe headaches, nosebleeds, and nightmares, but his hallucinations were specifically tailored to his trauma. He saw the mangled victim of his car accident approaching him with accusations and demands for justice, while experiencing flashbacks to the moment of impact that felt more real than his actual memories. The grandfather clock's chiming became associated with the sound of screeching brakes and crushing metal from the accident. After Chrissy's death, Fred went out to the trailer park with Nancy to report on it and investigate a bit when Vecna got him. He was found with his bones snapped and eyes destroyed, his body twisted in the same grotesque manner as Chrissy's, while his tape recorder continued running nearby. Fred's death opened the second gate to the Upside Down, proving Vecna's expanding power. Fred's journalistic instincts couldn't protect him from psychological torture, designed specifically to exploit his deepest shame and regret: Patrick's death. Patrick McKinney was a star basketball player at Hawkins High who appeared confident and successful on the court, but he was secretly enduring physical and emotional abuse from his alcoholic father at home. His athletic achievements became a way to escape his traumatic home life, but the constant fear and hypervigilance required to survive his father's violence made him perfect prey for Vecna's psychological manipulation. The contrast between his public success and private suffering created the emotional wounds Vecna needed to establish his curse. Patrick's hallucinations forced him to relive the worst moments of his father's abuse, with visions of being beaten and belittled that felt more intense and painful than the original experiences. He saw his father's face twisted with rage while hearing threats and insults that reinforced his fears of worthlessness and helplessness. The cursed symptoms of headaches and nosebleeds were particularly severe for Patrick, as his body was already conditioned to expect pain and violence. Patrick was at Lover's Lake with the basketball team, trying to track down Eddie when Vecna claimed him when he was in the water. His body levitated above the lake's surface before his bones snapped and eyes were gouged out, creating the third gate to the Upside Down. His teammates watched in horror as their friend died in the same brutal manner as the previous victims. Patrick's athletic strength couldn't save him from psychological vulnerabilities created by years of abuse and trauma at home. Victor Asylum. Victor Creel was a World War II veteran who witnessed his wife Virginia and daughter Alice die in 1959 when his son Henry used telekinetic powers to murder them while making it appear supernatural. Victor was blamed for the killings and sentenced to life in Penhurst Mental Hospital, where he spent over 2 decades in isolation, medicated and treated as violently insane. His actual memories of that night were suppressed by trauma, leaving him with fragmented recollections that made him question his own sanity. Victor's asylum experience included electroshock therapy, forced medication that left him catatonic for months, and solitary confinement in padded cells when his delusions about supernatural forces became too disruptive. The staff dismissed his attempts to explain what really happened as the ravings of a family annihilator, while other patients feared him as a child killer. His only anchor to reality was music, specifically Dream a Little Dream of Me, which had somehow protected him during Henry's attack by connecting him to happier memories. Victor remained institutionalized until 1986 when Nancy and Robin interviewed him about the Creel House murders, finally learning the truth about his son's powers and the supernatural forces plaguing Hawkins. His decades of imprisonment for crimes he didn't commit, combined with the knowledge that his own son was responsible for destroying his family, represented a form of psychological torture that lasted far longer than any physical torment. Victor's survival meant living with the knowledge that he'd been helpless to protect his family from his own child's evil. Enzo and Russian prisoners. Systematic dehumanization. Dmitry Enzo Antonov was a Russian prison guard at the Kamchatka facility who showed humanity by helping Jim Hopper survive, but his compassion made him a target for the Soviet system's brutal punishment methods. Along with other political prisoners and foreign captives, Enzo faced systematic torture designed to break the human spirit through physical pain, psychological manipulation, and forced participation in horrific spectacles. The Russian Gulag system was engineered to strip away dignity and individual identity through calculated cruelty. The prisoners, including American captives and Soviet dissidents, were subjected to starvation tactics, forced labor in freezing conditions, and beatings that left permanent physical damage. The most horrific aspect was being forced to fight demogorgons in gladiatorial combat for the entertainment of Russian officials, with survival dependent on killing otherworldly monsters barehanded. Those who refused to fight were fed to the creatures immediately, while survivors faced additional battles until they eventually succumbed. Enzo's betrayal of the system led to him being stripped of his guard status and thrown in with the prisoners he'd previously overseen, experiencing the full brutality of the camp's dehumanization process. The psychological torture of knowing that mercy and compassion were punished with extreme suffering created moral conflicts that broke many prisoners mentally before the physical abuse killed them. The Russian prison system showed how human institutions could rival supernatural horrors in their systematic cruelty and complete disregard for human dignity. Billy's mind flayer possession. Billy Hargrove Musgrove was a troubled teenager with anger issues and an abusive home life who worked as a lifeguard at Hawkins Community Pool during the summer of 1985. His aggressive personality and emotional vulnerabilities made him the perfect target when the Mind Flayer needed a human host to execute its plan for invading Hawkins. Billy's possession began when he crashed his car while investigating strange noises, coming into contact with infected rats that served as the Mind Flayer's initial transmission method. The possession process stripped Billy of his autonomy while forcing him to maintain a facade of normalcy around his co-workers and family. Under the Mind Flayer's control, he began consuming toxic chemicals like fertilizers and cleaning supplies, causing internal caustic damage and black veining to appear across his body. He experienced constant physical pain and sickness while being forced to kidnap and convert other residents into the Flayed, including Heather Holloway and her parents. Billy's most horrific moments came when he briefly regained consciousness and tried to warn Max and the others about the danger, only to be forced back under control. He died on July 4, 1985, impaled by the Mind Flayer's tentacles after finally breaking free long enough to protect Eleven. His last act of rebellion costing him his life. Billy's possession showed how the Mind Flayer could turn victims into unwilling accomplices while they remained partially aware of their actions. Will's repeated possessions. Will Byers was just 12 years old when he was abducted on November 6, 1983, beginning a cycle of supernatural encounters that would plague him for years. His initial week trapped in the Upside Down involved hiding from demogorgons in the toxic environment, slowly dying from starvation and poisonous air quality before being found cocooned with a vine forced down his throat. Even after his rescue, Will remained psychically linked to the Upside Down through lingering spores in his system. In 1984, Will became fully possessed by the Mind Flayer, experiencing excruciating pain whenever the entity was harmed and being used to manipulate his friends and family. The possession required a brutal exorcism where his loved ones subjected him to intense heat while he convulsed and screamed, the Mind Flayer's departure leaving him traumatized. His ordeal continued with chronic visions that allowed him to sense supernatural threats, making him a living early warning system for future attacks. Will's suffering extended beyond the supernatural into social isolation, earning the cruel nickname Zombie Boy at school, while struggling with his sexuality and feeling increasingly alienated as his friends matured. His unexpressed feelings for Mike Wheeler and constant fear of the Upside Down's return created ongoing emotional trauma that compounded his physical ordeals. Will's survival came at the cost of normal childhood development, leaving him permanently changed by his encounters with otherworldly forces. Henry's transformation into Vecna. Henry Creel was a disturbed child who discovered his telekinetic powers in 1959 and used them to murder his family, eventually becoming Subject 1 at Hawkins' lab under Dr. Brenner's experiments. His psychic abilities made him incredibly dangerous, but his arrogance and sadism led to his downfall when he attempted to convince Eleven to join him in destroying humanity. Their psychic battle on September 8, 1979, ended with Eleven overpowering him and banishing him to another dimension through a portal she accidentally created. Henry's fall through the dimensional barrier subjected him to the Upside Down's hostile environment, where constant lightning storms electrocuted and mutilated his body over time. The transformation was gradual and agonizing as his nose disappeared, his hand elongated into claws, and his veins merged with the dimension's vine network. His skin became pale and mottled while retaining patches of his human appearance, suggesting he maintained awareness throughout his horrific metamorphosis. The creature that emerged as Vecna retained Henry's memories and personality, but was trapped in a hellish landscape for years, developing the Mind Flayer from shadow particles and plotting his revenge against Eleven and humanity. His transformation represents the ultimate punishment: eternal life as a monster in dimensional exile, unable to die but unable to truly live. Henry's fate combined physical transformation with psychological isolation in a way that made death seem merciful by comparison. Max's broken survival. Max Mayfield was dealing with guilt and grief over her stepbrother Billy's death when Vecna targeted her in March 1986, exploiting her survivor's guilt and self-blame for wishing Billy would disappear before the Mind Flayer killed him. Her initial escape from Vecna's mental trap came through the power of her favorite song, Running Up That Hill by Kate Bush, which anchored her to positive memories and allowed her friends to pull her back to reality. Max's second encounter with Vecna was voluntary, as she served as bait to help her friends infiltrate the Upside Down and attack the villain in his lair. The plan partially succeeded, but not before Vecna completed his ritual by breaking her limbs, snapping her bones audibly while she levitated helplessly in the cemetery. Her eyes were gouged out and she experienced clinical death for over a minute before Eleven used her powers to restart Max's heart. Max survived but remained in a coma with permanent blindness, broken arms and legs, and potential brain damage from her brief death. Her consciousness may be trapped in Vecna's mental realm, making her survival questionable at best. She exists in a vegetative state that torments her friends and stepfather, while leaving her fate uncertain for future seasons. Max's rescue felt more like prolonged suffering than salvation, proving that sometimes survival can be worse than death. Eleven's lab experiments. Jane Hopper, known as 11, was raised from early childhood in Hawkins National Laboratory as part of Dr. Brenner's MK Ultra-inspired experiments designed to weaponize psychic abilities. Her daily existence involved sensory deprivation tanks, forced telekinetic testing, and constant psychological manipulation by Brenner, who presented himself as a father figure while subjecting her to systematic abuse. The experiments caused regular nosebleeds, strokes, and temporary power loss when she overexerted her abilities. Eleven's punishments for disobedience included solitary confinement in dark rooms, developing severe claustrophobia and fear of abandonment that persisted long after her escape. She witnessed the massacre of other test subjects by Henry Creel in 1979, surviving only because Brenner placed her in isolation after she refused to spy on a Russian agent. Her suppressed memories of the event were later recovered through the Nina Project, which involved collar shocks and forced reliving of traumatic experiences. The laboratory's systematic abuse stripped 11 of normal human development, leaving her with limited vocabulary, social skills, and emotional regulation. Her mother, Terry Ives, suffered electroshock therapy into a catatonic state after trying to rescue her daughter, showing how the lab's cruelty extended to anyone who threatened their control. Eleven's eventual escape only began years of learning to function in normal society. Eleven's childhood was stolen by institutional cruelty that left permanent psychological scars despite her eventual freedom. Hopper's Russian imprisonment. Jim Hopper was presumed dead after the Battle of Starcourt on July 4, 1985, but he was actually captured by Russian forces and transported to a brutal prison camp in Kamchatka, where he spent 8 months enduring systematic torture and dehumanization. His imprisonment began with his head being shaved, brutal beatings to extract information, and starvation tactics designed to break his will while forcing him to work on the Trans-Siberian Railway in freezing conditions. The Gulag's most horrific aspect was forcing prisoners to fight demogorgons in gladiatorial combat for the entertainment of Russian officials, with Hopper barely surviving multiple encounters through desperate improvisation and help from fellow prisoner Dmitry Antonov. The psychological torture of knowing he was presumed dead while his loved ones grieved compounded his physical suffering, making him question whether survival was worth the ongoing agony. Hopper's escape attempts were met with increased brutality, including solitary confinement and reduced food rations that left him gaunt and weakened. His eventual rescue by Joyce and Murray came only after months of torture had fundamentally changed him, leaving him with trauma that would affect his relationships and mental health long after returning to Hawkins. Hopper's imprisonment demonstrated how human cruelty could match supernatural horror in its capacity to break the human spirit. If you enjoyed this video and want to see horrifying scenes that got deleted from Stranger Things, click now.